This week we're studying, of course, Parsha Tetze, and the Parsha actually doesn't have a sort of one theme or one story that goes through it. Instead, the Parsha seems to be a collection of, many, many different mitzvahs, again, seemingly without any one thread or theme that goes through all of them. It's like the Torah just decided to cram, toward the end, all of the unfinished business, wrap it all up together and put it into one Parsha. There's many, many mitzvahs in this week's Parsha, and we'll touch on one or two of them. So to begin, I always like a good story or a good joke or a good little anecdote. So this one's a little dark, you'll forgive me, but it's got an important lesson, I think. So legend has it that there's a Yid, and he's Baruch Hashem 120 years old, and he's come to the end of his journey, and he's Nebuch, he's in the hospital, and he's got a couple of days or a couple of hours left, and his children gather around him, and they have so much love for him, and they're so dedicated to him, and they say, Father, if there's anything that we can do to help, please, as long as you have koyach, please tell us what it is that we can do to help. And the father goes, no, everything is good. Everything is good. Anyways, but time is moving on, and their father seems to be slipping away from them. And finally, as it gets toward the end, the children are literally hovering around the bed. And there's one son in particular that had, let's just say, a strained relationship with his father his whole life. In every family, there's always at least one. With this particular child struggled in his relationship with the father. So as their elderly father is closing his eyes, the children gather around and they say, Tata, father, is there anything we can do? And the father opens his eyes and he scans around and he looks at the son with whom he's had this terribly painful relationship with. Let's call him Yankel. And he goes, Yankel, there's something you can do for me. And Yankel goes, all right, Tati, Papa, Father, tell me, what is it? I'll do anything. And the father says, if you don't mind, you're stepping on the oxygen pipe. Could you please remove your foot from the oxygen pipe so that I can continue to breathe? So anyways, it came to mind because, we're going to study about what children do for their fathers and what fathers do for their children. Sometimes, in what appears to be the most well-meaning circumstances, children sometimes hurt their parents very badly and without having any intention to. All right. And that's my introduction. Does that sound pretty or dark? In this week's Parsha, Parsha Tetze, Perek Chof Aleph, Possuk Tes chapter 21, verse 15. The Torah paints a very bizarre picture. The Torah says if a man shall have two wives, always a recipe for disaster. One he loves and one he hates, which also, of course, means he'll have two mothers-in-law, both of whom he loves. But that's the way the Torah presents the scenario. He's got two wives, he loves one and he hates the other. And they both bear him sons. The one he loves and the one he hates. And to his horror, the bein habechoyer, the firstborn son, is born to the woman he hates. V'hoya, says the Torah in verse 16, when it comes the day that he gives over in inheritance to his sons that which is his, he bequeaths his children his inheritance. He is forbidden to treat the son of the woman he loves as the firstborn and override the son of the woman he hates. Rather, concludes the Torah in this particular mitzvah, he is obligated to recognize the rights of the firstborn son of the woman he hates. And give him the double portion. In all of his possessions. That is, in all of the father's possessions, he has to give the son of the woman he hates a double portion. Kihu, because he, the son of the hated wife, His Reishis Oinai is the first of his strength. Loi mishpat habchoira, to him goes the judgment, the rights, the law of the firstborn son. So, all right, without getting too caught up in the legal part of this mitzvah, it's the Torah's way of actually teaching us the law, the very famous law that a firstborn gets a double portion, which in very simple terms means if a man has 3 children and the oldest is a bechor, then what he would do is he would divide his inheritance into 4 parts and give the oldest, the firstborn, the bechor, give him 2 shares of that 50%, and the other 2 would share the other 50%, which is 25% each. All right. That's the mitzvah that the Torah is telling us. The way the Torah presents it to us is that if a man has 2 wives and they each bear sons, but the oldest son, the bechor, is born to the woman he hates, he despises, he has to recognize the rights of this born son. He may not give those rights to the firstborn of the woman he loves, even though he's fond of that woman and despises the other one. He has to recognize mishpat habchoira, the law of the firstborn, which is the firstborn gets a double portion. All right, why does the Torah teach us the mitzvah in such a sort of twisted way? In other words, why don't you first tell me that a firstborn gets a double portion? That has not been explicitly mentioned anywhere in the Torah until here. A man has 2 wives, one he loves, one he hates. All right, a good question, but that's not for now. But be it as it may, the Torah makes it clear that this double portion business is a right of birth. Whichever bechor is born first, he is the one who gets the double portion. Okay? This is what it says in the Possuk. Right, after that, the Torah goes on to talk about a different mitzvah, which we're not going to get into, but I'm just mentioning because it's relevant to what we're going to discuss, which is if a man has a ben soyer or moira, which means a rebellious, wayward son, he doesn't listen to the voice of his father, the voice of his mother. It turns out, Chazal explain, he is a thief, he is a zoil v'soiva, he's a glutton, he is acting in a very rebellious way at a very early age. The Torah says his parents would take him to Beis Din, and if all the conditions were met, actually the ben soyer or moira would get capital punishment. The Gemara says it never quite panned out that way, and it never will. But the way the Torah lays out the mitzvah is that this ben soyer or moira, rebellious, wayward, gluttonous, stealing, lying son could end up with capital punishment. All right. But let's go back. Let's focus on this part, the story of the Torah. A man has 2 wives. Each of them give him a firstborn son. He has to recognize the rights of the firstborn son of the woman he hates. So here there is a Daas Zekeinim. Now the Daas Zekeim's interpretations on the Possuk are usually very cryptic. In this case, he writes uncharacteristically at length, and he articulates very clearly exactly what he's saying, and he drops a ripping bomb. I mean, it's you read it and your mind explodes. Again, one more time, let's review. The Torah says a man has 2 wives. Tell me if this starts to sound familiar to you. A man has 2 wives. 1 wife he loves, 1 wife he hates. Each of them bear him firstborn sons, but the woman he hates gives him the firstborn son first. He has to recognize the rights, the mishpat habchoira, the firstborn rights of the son of the woman he hates, and not give those rights to the son of the woman he loves. Right? Sounding familiar yet? Says the Daas Zekeinim. I'm going to read it. It's a couple of lines. It's very powerful. Says the Daas Zekeinim, and if you'll ask, Hare Yaakov, what about Yaakov? Yaakov also had 2 wives. He actually had 2 wives and their maidservants, but we're focused on Yaakov's 2 wives, Rochel and Leah. Remember Rochel and Leah all the way back in Bereshit? Yaakov has 2 wives. 1 he loves and 1 he hates. Vayar Hashem kisnu Leah. Hashem saw that Yaakov hated Leah. And they both bore him firstborn sons. Leah gave him the firstborn son called Reuven, And Rochel gave him a firstborn son called Yosef. And who was born first? Reuven. Now go back and read the Possuk. Doesn't sound so simple anymore. If a man has two wives, Yaakov marries Rochel and Leah. One he loves and one he hates. He loves Rochel, he hates Leah. And they both give him sons. But v'hoya habein habachor lasniya, the firstborn son is born to the woman he hates. Warns the Torah, don't give the double port, don't be biased here. We tell the father, don't cheat the system. You may not give the double portion to the son of the woman you love. Loi mishpat abchoira, you have to recognize the b'choir ben asnua yakir, recognize the rights of the b'choir, the firstborn son of the woman you hate. Ki hu reishis oinoi, because he is the first of his strength, and he deserves it. Says the Daas Zekeinim, I don't understand what's going on here. The description fits Yaakov to the T. Yaakov has these two wives, one he loves and one he hates. And what does Yaakov do? The exact opposite of what the Possuk says he should do. Yaakov biker Yosef ben ahuva al pnei Reuven ben asnua. Yaakov gives the double portion to Yosef, the son of the woman he loves, and passes over Reuven, the son of the woman he hates. Now, what is he referring to? So all of this is explicit in the verses in Bereshis. The Torah says that before Yaakov passed, Yaakov called his son Yosef, and he told his son Yosef that he was going to give him a double portion. And he said to Yosef, you have two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, quote, Ephraim and Manasseh ki Reuven v'Shimon yiyuli. Ephraim and Manasseh will inherit by me, just like Reuven and Shimon. Even though Ephraim and Manasseh were his grandsons, not his sons, he gave Yosef a double portion so that Ephraim and Manasseh, his two grandsons, would inherit just like his sons. Says Yaakov, I'm going to give you an extra portion above your brothers, so that Ephraim and Manasseh can each get an equal share. And in fact, that's what happened. When the Jewish people inherited Eretz Yisrael, and Eretz Yisrael was divided among the tribes, Ephraim and Manasseh inherited a portion in Eretz Yisrael, ki Reuven v'Shimon, as Yaakov said. What about the Reuven? Well, on Yaakov's deathbed, he has some pretty harsh words for Reuven. And he tells Reuven, b'choir, you're my b'choir, you're my firstborn, and yet Yaakov tells him he's only going to get one portion. Yaakov was upset with him. And so Yosef gets the double portion. Says the Daas Zekeinim, I don't understand. How could Yaakov violate such an articulately spelled out command in the Torah, which is literally describing his very situation? Just ignore it and do the exact opposite of what Yaakov was supposed to do. When the Torah shouts, "Abachor ben asnua yakir," recognize the rights of the firstborn son of the woman you hate. Loi mishpat abchora, the rights, the firstborn rights are his. Yaakov just ignores it and does the very thing the Torah says he shouldn't do, gives the son of the woman he loves a double portion. How could he do such a thing? Says the Daas Zekeinim, not a problem. Why? Yaakov didn't give Yosef a double portion because he loved his mother Rochel, and he didn't withhold the double portion from Reuven because he hated his mother Leah. That wasn't it. Rather, bepshi'osai shel Reuven hoya, because Reuven sinned. That's why Yaakov took away his double portion. When Reuven sinned, Yaakov took away his double portion. V'nosnal Yosef, and gave it to Yosef. Shapirnis Aviv, who sustained, who Yosef fed his father the last years of his life when there was a famine in the world and the whole world was desperate for food. Yosef provided them with food. It has nothing to do. The Daas Zekeinim answers. It has nothing to do with the fact that Yaakov loved Yosef's mother and hated Reuven's mother. Nothing to do with that. This was on the merit of Yosef and Reuven themselves. Reuven, says the Daas Zekeinim, was Posheya. He sinned against his father. Yosef sustained his father. And therefore, concludes the Daas Zekeinim, although in general, lo yuchal levaker, a father is not allowed to distinguish, he's not allowed to differentiate, he's not allowed to, what's the word I'm looking for? Discriminate against his children. But nevertheless, in Parsha be'aviv, if a child sins against his father, yivienu lebezdin, the father can bring his son to Bezdin, kidim afarish va'ozil, as the Torah goes on to explain. So what the Daas Zekeinim here means is that the next thing the Torah says is a scenario where parents take their own children to court, to Bezdin. It says the Daas Zekeinim, if a father feels that his own firstborn son is sinning against him, is mistreating him, and he has another son that's treating him right, the father can take his sons to Bezdin and remove from the biologically firstborn son the firstborn rights, and give it to another son whom the father feels is treating him well. This is the explanation of the Daas Zekeinim. So again, the Daas Zekeinim is saying, in Yaakov's case, although the description seems to fit, when you first read it, you like sort of mind boggles you. The description seems to fit perfectly. Nevertheless, says the Daas Zekeinim, in case of Yaakov, it had nothing to do. The way Yaakov treated Yosef and Reuven had nothing to do with Yaakov's sentiments toward their mothers, toward Rochel and Leah. It was not because of that. It had to do with Yaakov's relationship with the sons themselves. And it's true that if a father feels like his sons are not treating him well, some are treating him well and some are not, the father has the right, at least in consultation with Bezdin, to remove the rights of one son and give it to another son, as the Torah continues to say with the story of Ben Sayer and Moira, that sometimes parents will take their own children to Bezdin. Okay, this is the explanation of the Baal Torah. This is the explanation of the Daas Zekeinim. Now, what is the Daas Zekeinim referring to when he says that Reuven sinned against his father, or Reuven rebelled against his father? He was Posheya. He sinned against his father. What is he actually referring to? So when I first read it, I assumed that he was referring to that famous story, which the Torah calls Bilbel Yitzua Yoviv. So the Torah says in Parshas Toldos that after the passing of Rochel, Vayelach Reuven went, Vayishka v'spilha pilegesh Oviv. Reuven, the literal meaning of the words is that Reuven went and he was intimate with Bilha, the concubine of his father, the maidservant of Rochel. Yaakov seems to hold this against Reuven till his dying day. In fact, in the parting words of Yaakov to his sons, Yaakov once again mentions this to Reuven, right? He says, Alisa mishkevei avicha, etc. On the surface, it seems that that's what Reuven is referring. That's what Yaakov. That's what the Daas Zekeinim is referring to when he speaks of this pshia, the sin of son against father, referring to this story. However, this is difficult to accept. It's difficult to accept that that's actually what the Daas Zekeinim is referring to. I'll tell you why. There's an expression in the Gemara Masechta Shabbos, very famous. The Gemara says, the Gemara says anybody who says that Reuven sinned is mistaken. He didn't sin. And the Possuk doesn't literally mean that Reuven was intimate with Bilha. Rather, what does the Gemara say? Very famously, that each one of the women, Rochel, Leah, Bilha, and Zilpah, each one had their own tent. And Yaakov's tent, and with a bed inside. And Yaakov's own bed was always in Rochel's tent. Rochel was the first of the 4 that passed. After Rochel passed, Yaakov went and put his his bed in the tent of Bila, which was Rochel's maidservant. And Reuven, the firstborn son of Leah, said, Ad Kan, said, this is not okay. And he moved his father's bed into Leah's tent. All right, there's more specifics to the story, but that's the general idea. That's all he did. He moved his father's bed. Now, he had no right to do it, and he was mixing in an area that wasn't his, etc. So it's considered as if, it's considered as if he was intimate with his father's concubine, with Bila, which he shouldn't have. All right, but it's not literal. This is what the Gemara says, very famous. Rashi actually quotes in the Chumash. Okay, so if Reuven didn't really do anything other than move a bed, and by the way, after Reuven moves Yaakov's bed to Rochel's tent, to Leah's tent, Yaakov stays there with Leah. He doesn't move it back. If that's all he did, move his father's bed from one tent to another, why is this called a pshia, such a sin, such a violation against his father, that Yaakov removes Reuven's double portion and gives it to who? To Yosef? Yosef disappeared from his father's life for 22 years. None of the children, it seems, caused their father as much aggravation as Yosef did. Yaakov talks about how the aggravation, the pain that he suffered from the loss of Yosef almost killed him. Rashi explains, the only thing worse than Rahman al-Islam, than losing a child, is thinking that you've lost a child when in actuality you have not lost the child. Because when a person loses a loved one, Hashem has put it into the nature of the world that with time, the pain, of course, it doesn't go away, but the pain seems to lessen with time. But that's only if the loved one is actually deceased. If the loved one is still very much alive, then the pain doesn't go away. So Yaakov is pining for his son Yosef for 22 years, thinking that Yosef is dead. In the meanwhile, Yosef is very much not dead. He's the most powerful person in the world. And Yosef knows his father thinks he's dead, or at least he has some idea that his father might think he's dead. And it's very difficult to understand why, when Yosef becomes viceroy of the whole Egypt and the most powerful man in the world, he doesn't send a message to his father to let him know that he's fine. Once again, we'll learn this more when we get to the Parshas and Bereshis. But be it as it may, Yosef doesn't seem like the model son either. And all Reuven did was move a bed. So let's go back to the Daas Zekeinim. The Daas Zekeinim says, how could Yaakov give a double portion to Yosef and ignore Reuven? Oh, says the Daas Zekeinim, the Torah is not saying you cannot change around the inheritance of the children. The Torah is just saying you cannot do it because of how you feel about their mothers. But Yaakov wasn't doing it because of how he felt about Rochel and Leah. This was an issue between him and his children. Reuven sinned against him. Yosef sustained him. So he took away the portion from Reuven and gave it to Yosef. Whoa! 1 second. Let's think about this logically here for a minute. Really? Yosef sustained him and Reuven sinned against him? What did Reuven do? Reuven moved the bed. If Yaakov wanted, he could have moved it back. And by the way, the reason why Yaakov does not move it back is because Yaakov knew every night which tent the Shechina was in, the Gemara says. And based on that, he knew where to retire for the night. So if he stayed in Leah's tent, that means the Shechina was in Leah's tent. That means that that's where he belonged. That's what Reuven did. And Yosef, the Groiser Tzaddik, Shapirnus Ovid, who sustained his father, sustained him just for the last few years of Yaakov's life, the 17 best years of Yaakov's life granted, after torturing him for 22 years. when you think about it that way, it starts to become a little difficult to believe that Yaakov's bias about their mother isn't playing a role here. No, really, it's not because of your relationship with Rochel, how much you love, and your relationship with Leah, how much you struggled with that. Nothing, just because of the sons. Starting to slip through our fingers here. Not to mention that even the fact that Reuven moved the beds against Yaakov's wishes, Yaakov put it in Bilhah's tent, and Reuven put the tent in Leah's bed. Even that story is still all about Yaakov's relationship with Rochel and Leah. That he loves Rochel so much that after Rochel passes, he puts his tent in Rochel's maidservant's tent. He puts his bed in Rochel's maidservant's tent. And Reuven moves it out. It seems like that's really the only significant story here. And yet the Daas Zekeinim insists, no, says the Daas Zekeinim. Reuven was posheya ba'oviv. He sinned against his father. And Yosef was mafarnas of it. Yosef sustained his father. It becomes difficult to understand. All right. Perhaps we can explain it this way. The truth of the matter is that Reuven also took care of his father. In fact, there was a Toranut. There was a rotation of the sons taking care of their father Yaakov. They were all mechabdim. They were all fulfilling the mitzvah of kibud avayim. There's even special mention of this. Somewhere in the Torah we find special mention of the fact that Reuven was tending to his father Yaakov's needs. Where is this? For this, we got to go back once again to Parshas Vayeshev, to the story of Yosef's brothers selling him into slavery. Now, you'll remember, of course, that the brothers initially wanted to kill him. Shimon and Levi said, they literally said, let's kill him. Throw him into a pit, and that'll be the end of it. It was Reuven who stopped them. It was Reuven who stopped the brothers from killing him. Vayishma Reuven, the Possuk says, Reuven hears, he saves Yosef from the brothers. Vayomer tells them, we're not going to kill him. Reuven says, throw him into a pit. Reuven had every intention, the Torah says. Reuven had every intention of returning Yosef to their father. But Reuven disappears for a couple of verses, and when he comes back, Yosef is gone. In the meanwhile, Yehuda had come up with the idea that they sell Yosef into slavery, which they did. But Yoshev Reuven el Haboyer, the Possuk says, Reuven came back to the pit. Yosef isn't there. He doesn't know what happens. He turns to his brothers and he says, the young man is gone. What am I going to do? Says Rashi very famously, what do you mean Reuven returned to the pit? Where was he? Well, according to the first explanation of Rashi, it was Reuven's turn. Higia yoimoi. It was his day to go and serve his father. So the brothers obviously, well, I shouldn't say obviously, assumedly, waited for Reuven to go because they knew he wouldn't let them do this. They waited for him to go to his father, take care of him, and while he was gone, boom. Yehuda proposes that they sell him. They do. Reuven comes back and it's over. So Reuven was also tending to his father. So what's the problem? I think perhaps one of the ways of explaining this can be based on the word that the Daas Zekeinim uses of Peshia. Peshia, we're translating it as a sin, like a Posheya as a sinner. Reuven posha ba'oviv, he sinned against his father. But there's a different translation of the word, or there's a different, the word pshia can be explained, interpreted in a different context. Pshia can also be interpreted in the term of negligence, right? The Talmud speaks quite a bit about a shomer who's poisheya. A shomer who's poisheya means a shomer, a watchman, who's negligent in the watching of an object. A shomer, a watchman who is responsible for something, has to take care of it, may not be poisheya, may not be negligent in his duties to watch the thing. Perhaps when we say that Reuven was poisheya ba'oviv, we don't mean that he sinned against his father, but we mean that he was negligent in watching something. Well, what was he supposed to watch, and what was he negligent in? See, my friends, it turns out there's a second explanation in this Rashi, which we just quoted, which deals with the question, where was Reuven while Yosef was sold into slavery? The oldest brother, the one who assumes responsibility. Where was he the day Yosef was sold into slavery? Why did he not stop it? Well, one explanation of Rashi is the one I just said, that Reuven went to take care of his father. There's a second explanation. Says Rashi, also koya b'sakoy v'tanisoi al shel bilbil yitzui oviv. Although this was a couple of years, the story of Yosef and his brothers is a couple of years after Reuven moves his father's bed, Reuven was in sackcloth and fasting, doing teshuvah. Reuven was doing teshuvah, which, by the way, is another reason why Yaakov wouldn't hold it against him. Years later, he's still doing teshuvah in sackcloth and fasting. What's the problem? He was in sackcloth and he was fasting for what he had done, and that's why he missed the moment that Yosef was sold into slavery. When he came back, it was all over. And the commentaries point out very famously that although Reuven had noble intentions, this is a terrible stain on Reuven's record. Knowing as he did that his brothers and Yosef had unresolved issues, knowing as he did the danger that the strife between the brothers already did pose, and knowing as he did his ability to defuse the situation and to literally save Yosef's life, as he did, Reuven should have realized that he has an obligation to protect Yosef. Reuven should have realized that he needed to be there to make sure nothing happened to him, and yet he walked away from his obligations to put sackcloth on his head, fast and do teshuvah for a sin he had committed years ago. Motivated by righteousness, Reuven was poisheya. He was negligent in his protection for Yosef. And because of that, Yosef is sold into slavery. Had he known, had he fully absorbed his own responsibility in this situation, he would have forgotten, at least temporarily, about the teshuvah that he was doing for a sin he had committed years ago. He would have thrown away his sackcloth. He would have eaten a healthy breakfast. He would have closed the Tehillim and stood in front of the pit where Yosef was lying and his brothers wanted to kill him or sell him into slavery. And he would have said, no, I'm going to stand here and protect this Jewish boy. And make sure you don't do anything to him. Make sure you don't sell him into slavery and sell him to the Goyim. Had he done so, perhaps he would have saved Yosef from a terrible plight of being sold into slavery. He would have saved his father from 22 years of pining for Yosef and thinking that he's dead. And he would not have been a poisheya b'shmirasa. He would not have been negligent in his guarding Yosef. Instead, off he went to pray and to cry and to beat his chest and to say al-Chait. and with sackcloth on his head, do teshuvah for a sin he couldn't forgive himself that he had committed so many years ago. And in the process, while he's crying and davening and beating his chest, brothers sell their other brother into slavery, and he could have prevented it. The Lubavitcher Rebbe once said very famously, he was talking about the responsibility that Jews have, that one Jew has for another, not just a physical responsibility, but of course also a spiritual responsibility. He said, a slick Yiddish kind in a grub, a Jewish boy, a Jewish child, a 17-year-old teenager is lying in a pit. How dare you be so selfish as to go and beat your chest in shul with sackcloth on your head and fasting for a sin you committed years ago. Close your tehillim, walk out of shul, go into the streets and save the Jewish child who's lying in the pit. Once every Jewish child's been saved, we can go back and talk about the teshuvah you want to do for sins you did years ago. I'm sure you know Chabad has once a year what they call an annual international gathering of shluchim from all over the world. And they always have keynote speakers, speak from all different places. Years ago, I heard one of the rabbis said, he said the Lubavitcher Rebbe once had his secretary wake up what I believe is the head shaliach of Italy. He had his secretary call him at 3:00 in the morning. Wake the guy up. And the shliach, this guy wakes up 3:00 in the morning. His phone was ringing. Once upon a time, phones would actually ring. And his phone rings and he wakes up and he answers the phone. It's the Lubavitcher Rebbe's secretary. And he's like, hello, yes? And the secretary says, did I wake you? And the guy says, well, I'm up now, so yeah, what is it? He says, well, I want to know if I woke you. He's like, well, I'm listening. Tell me, what is it that you want to say? He said, the Rebbe told me to call you and ask you if I woke you. He said, well, yes, it's 3:00 in the morning. Of course he woke me. The secretary said, the Rebbe told me that if you should respond, yes, I have woken you, he wanted me to ask you, quote, how could you be sleeping at 3:00 in the morning when there are Jewish children in Italy who are not yet receiving a Jewish education? Responsibility. And with that, he wished him an enjoyable rest of his evening and hung up the phone. That was the message. What's that supposed to mean? That the rabbi's not supposed to sleep? It's supposed to mean that he's supposed to function on no sleep. No human being can function on no sleep. A person will expire, and then of course they'll be useless. That wasn't the point. The point the Rebbe was trying to impress upon him is, are you aware of the danger? Are you sensitive to the danger, the existential threat to Jewish children who are not receiving a Jewish education? This is not some theoretical concept. If you're in a position to do something, for crying out loud, do something. You're responsible. In that sense, Reuven fell short. Perhaps it was that, more than anything, that troubled Yaakov. He didn't want to give a double portion to a son who would be too busy with his sackcloth and fasting to be there to protect the destiny of a fellow Jew. That's not the son, says Yaakov, that I'm going to give a double portion to. Instead, it was going to be Yosef. Now, Yosef's journey is very complicated. Yosef from day one was different. Yosef has these dreams and he's going to go out into the world and he's going to be the king. And the Possuk says, Vayigar Boyoviv, the Possuk says that Yaakov admonished his son Yosef. And he told him, I don't understand your dream. Yaakov told Yosef, I don't understand how your dream's going to come true. It's impossible. But Yaakov Shomar Sadover, Yaakov, the Torah tells us, also saw something in Yosef that nobody else saw. The Daas Zekeinim says that Yosef nurtured his father. Pirnesis Oviv. It's a quote from the Medrash. But it doesn't only mean that Yosef gave his father food. Again, Reuven doesn't only mean that he took care of him physically. Again, Reuven was also taking care of his father physically. All the brothers took care of their father physically. There was something that Yaakov saw in Yosef, that when he saw it, he said, you're going to be the one to carry the double portion. Ephraim u'Menashe ki Reuven v'Shimon yiyuli. There was something sustaining about Yosef that when Yaakov saw it, he said, this child is going to inherit a double portion in Eretz Yisrael. And there was something that Yaakov saw in Reuven that said, this child is not going to inherit the double portion. Well, what was it? It turns out that the counterpart to Reuven's dropping the ball, not being there for a fellow when he needed him to be there, is Yosef, the one who is there for his brothers and his family till his dying day when they need him. Having the ability to put the past aside, to put the animosity aside, to put all the unresolved issues aside. Almost till the very end, the brothers make Yosef's life miserable, right at the end of the whole story. Even after Yaakov is dead, the brothers still make Yosef cry. They still tell him things that aren't true, that are emotionally abusing Yosef. And yet Yosef carries no resentment towards them. Yosef is a provider and he's a sustainer. Yosef, says the Daas Zekeinim, Pirnesis Oviv. He sustained his father. I'll tell you what I think that means. I think it means that Yaakov is sitting there on his deathbed, surrounded by his 12 sons, 12 tzaddikim, the Gemara says, Vayu b'nei Yaakov shnei Moshe, 12 tzaddikim. Yaakov looks at his 12 sons. They all looked at him, the Medrash says, and cried out, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, at that moment. And Yaakov says, Baruch Shem Kvei Malchus Elel Vod. That's why the prayers are organized that way to this day. The Medrash says that's how we dive in that way. But Yaakov was a man with vision. And Yaakov says, yes, right now, Yaakov says, as I lie here and close my eyes, my family is beautiful. And my family is holy. We've healed. We've recovered. It was the 17 best years of Yaakov's life. Right now, the Jewish family, the Jewish nation is strong. There's a sense of purpose. There's a sense of identity, which is ironclad. Baruch Hashem. Baruch Shem Kvei Malchus Elel Vod. But Yaakov's got a pair of eyes, a physical pair of eyes, a spiritual pair of eyes. And Yaakov knows that what's going to follow is 3,500 years of Jewish history with very trying moments. Yaakov sees 210 years in Mitzrayim. Yaakov sees a Jewish nation who will lose one Beis HaMikdash and a second Beis HaMikdash and will end up in Golus for 2,000 years, where they'll have to deal with inquisitions and with crusades and with holocausts, Rahman al-Islam. Yaakov is lying in his deathbed and he sees, may Hashem protect us, a Jewish nation which is a house on fire because of assimilation and intermarriage. Yaakov sees Jewish children in Italy who are not getting a Jewish education, and Yaakov cannot sleep. Who's going to take care of my children? Who's going to make sure they don't get lost? Who's going to make sure that Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad is not something they say only when they stand around Yaakov's deathbed, but in 2022? Who's taking responsibility for Klal Yisrael? A father wants to know that he's leaving a message for his children, which is one that's going to last. No greater joy for a neshama after 120 to know that the children follow in the parents' path. What's going to be with Klal Yisrael? A father. A father. Responsibility. Yaakov is there. He needs to do something. And he looks at all 12 of his sons and he's deeply concerned, knowing full well what the Jewish people would go through and the trying moments, the persecutions, the b'chol doir v'doir oimdim aleinu l'chaloseinu, the attempts to annihilate the Jewish people in every generation. And knowing what the brothers themselves are capable of. Yaakov's eyes land on Yosef. And in Yosef, Yaakov sees the solution. In Yosef, Yaakov sees the future of Klal Yisrael. A brother who will stand up and say to his own flesh and blood, I bear no resentment against you. I will protect you. I will provide for you. I will do everything in my power to sustain you till the day I die and beyond, because you are my brothers. And Yaakov says he's the one. And he's going to get a double portion. Ephraim and Menashe, Yosef's two sons who will go in Yosef's path. Ki Reuven v'Shimon yiyu li. I need you to be the Reuvens and Shimons. Go and teach Klal Yisrael what it means to take responsibility for another Yid. Go and teach Klal Yisrael that no matter what Jews go through, we have to be able to put our differences aside and say, you are my brother and my sister. Go and teach this to the Jews in Eretz Yisrael. It's you, says Yaakov to Yosef, who are going to get a double portion. Concludes the Daas Zekeinim. This had absolutely nothing to do with Yaakov's sentiments towards Rochel and Leah. Nothing at all. At this point, Rochel and Leah are both in Gan Eden. Rochel was buried on the road. Yaakov is buried eternally with Leah. The children who had fought among themselves because some were the children of Rochel and some were the children of Leah, even that had been resolved. The children are now all getting along beautifully. There's something else that's tugging at Yaakov's heart. What is it? Reuven posha be'aviv. Reuven was negligent against his father. Well, what did he do against his father? What did he do against his father? Move his father's bed? I mean, that's also been resolved. What did Reuven do against his father? He didn't watch over Yosef. And Yaakov saw in that a danger to Klal Yisrael. Instead, he chose Yosef. Yosef, Pirnis Aviv. Yosef sustained his father by sustaining his brothers and by teaching the concept of Arvus and Kol Yisrael Reuven Zelazah. The Daas Zekeinim concludes that any time a father sees this in his sons, he should take his sons to Bezdin. That's why the Daas Zekeinim says the next mitzvah in the Torah speaks about parents who take their children to Bezdin. What does he mean? That a father should take his son to the rabbis and say, my son's not treating me right. I think what he means is that that if a father feels that his son is doing what Reuven did to his father, meaning he's not, what does that mean? That Reuven was a ben Sayer or Moira? No, it means that if a father feels that his son he's Poshei Abaviv, he's not mastering this lesson, doesn't know what it means to go out of your way to help another Yid, doesn't know what it means, responsibility of one Jew to another. Says the Daas Zekeinim, the Torah says sometimes you have to take your son to Bezdin. What's a Bezdin? Bezdin is a court. What do they do for a living? What's their job? Actually, their job is to tend to the needs of Klal Yisrael. The ultimate icon of responsibility for Klal Yisrael is the Bezdin. That's the reason, says the Daas Zekeinim, why the next thing the Torah says is that if a man has a ben Sayer or Moira, a rebellious son, that we tell the parents, drag your son to Bezdin. If parents feel that they are unable to instill this quality in their child, then take him to a Bezdin, but not a selfish Bezdin, not a Bezdin that beats their chests and cries and fasts for sins they did years ago, that while in doing so are ignoring bleeding Jews in the street. Not that kind of a Bezdin. That's not a real Bezdin. Not a Bezdin at all. But a Bezdin who will stand up and fight for a fellow Yid. A Bezdin who can look at a fellow Yid like Yosef and say, no matter what we go through, we're brothers, and I will treat you as such. Take your child to a Bezdin like that. Perhaps the Bezdin can explain to your son that Jewish existence is dependent on nothing more than our understanding that we, Jews, are responsible for each other. And if you have one who gets that message, says the Daas Zekeinim, and another one who doesn't, be sure to give the double portion to the Yosefs of the world, and never to the Reuvens of the world. The Reuvens, in that sense, will take the double portion and just use it for themselves. The Yosefs will take the double portion and invest it in their fellow Jew. May Hashem bless us all with a wonderful, good, sweet new year. Once again, this Shiur is dedicated to Ili Nishmas and Mrs. Miriam Fleischman, who was an avid participant in this Shiur, and we miss her very much. May her neshama have an aliyah. May the family have only brachas and simchas, and for all of Klal Yisrael, a good kibbutz Shiur.